Well, good morning again, everyone. Good to see you, John and Deb. Good to see you here. It's good to be back here again after a few weeks. This morning I want to look at the gospel passage that we just had read to us. And it's one of those passages with really, like all of the scriptures really, where it's really crucial to look at the context in which this story appears in the Gospels and in the context of the situation that was facing the church or the people of Jesus' day. And what he said about humility as well, because what we know about humility today is very, very different to how humility was seen back 2,000 years ago when Jesus walked the earth and when this story appeared. We read it through a lens, this story, in which humility is something to be honoured. We have huge respect for those who are humble. Even in major sporting competitions, we honour people who are humble, even when they achieve the greatest heights of sporting glory. But that wasn't the case in the first century when Jesus told this story. So the culture Jesus lived in was an honour and shame culture, where it was all about your reputation, how you were seen by other people, and you needed to lift yourself up to make sure that you were seen in a good light by others to build up your honour. And shame was what you might imagine it to be. It was to be avoided at all costs. Anything that might damage the way you were seen by your peers was to be avoided. It was all about how you appeared. John Dixon, the Australian historian, has written a lot about this. He wrote a book years ago called Humilitas, which talks about the concept of humility back in Jesus' time and how Jesus totally revolutionised the whole concept of that. What he says was that in Jesus' time, many decisions that were taken in life, so whether they be political, military, moral, relational or family decisions, were decided along the whole honour-shame idea and framework. The question was, does it bring honour or does it bring shame to us? Even people like Aristotle, the great Greek philosopher, who was probably seen as more ethical than most in the ancient world, didn't see humility as a virtue like we do today. He said that honour and reputation were amongst the most pleasant things to a human being. It was mostly when you really are honourable, but also when you were seen to be honourable by people around you. And so that's how the ancient mind thought. It was all about how you appeared and as a place and as a person of honour. And so the word humility was often used in a derogatory context. You could be humble toward the emperor in Rome because he might kill you. So you need to bow and scrape to him. You could be humble before the gods because you were seen as lesser than them. And that was how it was seen. But the idea that you should be humble towards an equal of yours was just unthinkable in that time. And Jesus totally upended that. And we see that in this story today in the Gospel of Luke. Now, Jesus, of course, said a lot of things about being humble. Whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant, and so on. But when historians look at that, and when people like John Dixon looks at this, he says that what really triggered the revolution in humility that Jesus started was his crucifixion. Crucifixion was the most shameful way to die in the ancient world. Romans would line up people to be crucified on the roads leading into cities to say that if you defy or dare to defy the might of Rome, this is your fate. This is your fate. You'll be crucified as well. So the idea that a great person would end up voluntarily on a cross, it was just ridiculous thinking. And it just upends the whole Greek or Roman idea of honour and shame in that culture. So when Christians watched Jesus die, his disciples watched Jesus die on a cross, they had to work out, well, was he a failure then? Did he fail because he died such a shameful death? Wasn't he as great as they really thought he was? Or does Jesus' death mean that we have to radically reinterpret what greatness is? And about it being a willingness to lower yourself for the sake of others. And that's what they did, of course. That's what Christians did in the first century. They totally revolutionised what they saw in Jesus as humility being a virtue instead of something derogatory. And so Christians started using this word humility to refer as something positive about lowering yourself for others and not being forced down low. And probably the first bit of writing in Western history that we see this as a virtue is in Paul's letter to the Philippians. I'll read that out here. He says, "In humility, consider others better than yourselves. Your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing. He humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross." And that's probably the first passage in Western history that we have that shows humility as a virtue. The Apostle Paul, in his other letters too, plays on that idea. And so by the end of the first century, moving onwards then, many people are starting to use the words humble yourself before others as a good thing. And then further on, by the end of the 5th and 6th centuries, it's even spread out to secular culture where humility is seen as a virtue. And today, of course, it doesn't matter whether you're an atheist or a Christian or whatever you are, most of us think that when you're great but you're humble, it's a beautiful thing. And we really lift up people like that. People who might do great achievements but they're humble. We really lift those up, and we even want to be like people like that. And Jesus reinterpreted all of that about what honour is really about. And he reinterpreted what greatness is. Martin Luther King gave a sermon on this about a year or so before he died in the late 60s. It's called The Drum Major Instinct. And if you can get a copy of that online, I'd encourage you to. The Drum Major Instinct, Martin Luther King sermon. And in that sermon, he tells a story of James and John when they come to Jesus and say, can we sit at your left and right hand when you come in your glory? And he talks about greatness then, and Jesus asks them, basically, do you know what you're saying? Do you know what you're asking? Can you really do this? And he says that Jesus doesn't condemn James and John for asking that question, for wanting greatness, but he basically turns it around and says, if you want to be great, great. Be great at serving. Be great at giving yourself for others. Be great at loving your neighbour. And so again, in that story too, he upends what greatness is all about. Some years ago, I wrote an article called "What Donald Trump and Jesus Have in Common." And what I was referring to in that was they both talk about greatness. Donald Trump's idea of greatness is about self-glorification, putting yourself first, and to hell with anyone who gets in the way. Now, it's easy to get angry at someone like Trump like that, but I think what a sad way to live, to always have to put yourself first and to think you have to do that. From all reports, Donald Trump's father was a bit of a brute, and so Trump himself had to always feel like he had to prove himself. And then you contrast that to Jesus' idea of greatness, where it's about service of others and finding life that way, and finding the life I've always been looking for that way. And it's interesting too to note the father impact of that. In the men's movement stuff that I'm part of, we talk about the father wound often that many men and women have too. But Jesus, at his baptism, had the voice of his father saying, "This is my son with whom I'm well pleased." He had that affirmation. I think so many men in our society have that wound where they were never given that affirmation that they needed. Roland Croucher, who served at this church some years ago, said that in his many thousands of hours of counselling men, he would say that the number of men, or the percentage of men who, when they were entering puberty, 12, 13, 14 years old roughly, the percentage of men who could say that their father, their biological father, was their male role model was 2%. 2% of men had their father as their male role model. So we've grown up as a fatherless generation in many ways. So we have a crisis of masculinity in this country, where we have addiction, violence, men who are emotionally underdeveloped, boys running around in men's bodies in deep emotional pain, mental ill health, loneliness. That's why I love movements like the Centre for Men that I'm part of it runs out of Brisbane, where they run this men's rites of passage each year, where they take men through what it means to be an authentic male in our culture, which we've often lost. And I think that literally saves lives, because it teaches men to be servants, to give of ourselves in the service of others. And I think it saves a lot of men from committing harm to themselves and to others. Saves their partners who might be victims of that harm. There's a lot we can learn about that. And we can look at the example of Jesus as the ultimate man, if you like, who said that life is found in the service of others, and that the whole law and the prophets is summed up in the command to do unto others as we would want them to do unto us. Jesus was a guy who was sensitive. He was unafraid to show emotion, treated women with respect, stood up for the underdog, for the lowly, and showed, taught and lived what compassion and love are really about. So the truly humble person, as Jesus shows in this passage, man or woman, is one who doesn't need to make themselves great. There's someone whose life speaks greatness because of their service of others. And in this story, Jesus, it's interesting that verse 1, it says he was being watched. And in that passage, the idea was he was being watched to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. And verses 2 to 6 that we didn't have read out today in the lectionary reading, Jesus does go on to heal someone on the Sabbath and causes an uproar by doing that very thing. And again, loving a person over legalistic rules that others had set in place. And he basically criticised them for their sense of moral superiority. I had a situation once that I was at a Christian conference years ago, and I was taught a bit of a lesson by someone. I saw this guy who was disabled sitting down on his own, and I thought I'll go and do the Christ-like thing and sit next to him. So I did, feeling pretty good about myself. And as I sat next to him, this guy leaned in and put his head on my shoulder and put his arm around me, and it just melted me. And here was I thinking I was going to minister to him, but he was ministering to me. And that gave me a lesson in humility about learning from others, learning from anyone about what it is to be loving. Tim Costello tells a similar story too about when he first went to St Kilda Baptist Church many years ago to be the pastor there. Tim, if you know his story, he came from a very middle-class background, raised in Blackburn, the middle of the Bible, the buckle of the Bible Belt, if you like, in terms of middle-class Christianity in this city. And he said that his attitude when he went to St Kilda was he was going to show them the gospel. He was going to convert them and show them what the gospel really is. But then he met a lady there who had a lot of mental health issues, who swore a lot. But what Tim noticed was that this woman was just so beautifully Christ-like and was always ministering to others. I've seen that here over the years too. It's just such a great example. And Tim said it was this lady who showed him what the gospel is as well, what the gospel is really about. So if you're like me and from a middle-class background, the whole surrendering of our ego is something that we need to do, and not to be the great rescuer, the hero. It's about humbling ourselves. And yes, we need to ask God to help us to minister to others, to show how we can do that. That's part of love, of course, as well. But we also need to ask God for the humility to be teachable and to let those who are different to us show us what the gospel is as well. And that's what I've learned so much in this church over many years. That it's not about you, it's not about me, it's about love. And how can we love better? How can we be shown love? How can we receive love from others and be open to that as well? The next part of this gospel passage is an interesting one as well, because it also shows that thing of humility, but also about who we invite to dinner. And the challenge here is to invite those who can't repay you. And again, it goes to this challenge, that whole honour-shame system that Jesus critiqued, if you like. We always want reciprocity. If we invite the high and mighty and people who will make us look good, that'll be an honourable thing. But Jesus says love doesn't ask for anything in return. He says, in effect, that virtue is its own reward. Love because it's loving, revealing a God of unlimited grace. And as I prepared for this week, I was reminded of a story that Philip Yancey tells in his book, What's So Amazing About Grace. And again, I think it was a reprint of that book a few years ago. And again, it's one of the books that's really revolutionised my life. And again, if you haven't read it, I'd highly recommend it. What's So Amazing About Grace. And in that book, Yancey says that Jesus talked a lot about wedding banquets, parties and so on, and dinners, which we have in this reading again today. And Yancey says, he tells a story about his favourite wedding banquet story, which happened in Boston in the US in June of 1990. And he says this about this story. He says, a woman accompanied by her fiancé went to the Hyatt Hotel in downtown Boston and ordered the meal for their wedding ceremony. This woman and her fiancé pored over the menu, made selections of fine china and silver, pointed to pictures of the flower arrangements they wanted to have. They both had pretty expensive taste, and the bill came to many thousands of dollars. And after leaving a deposit, they went home to flick through wedding announcements and how they would do all that to prepare. But then the day the announcements were supposed to go into people's letterboxes, the groom got cold feet. He said, well, I'm just not sure. It's a big commitment. When his understandably pretty cheesed off fiancé returned to the Hyatt Hotel to cancel it all, the events manager was really understanding. He said, the same thing happened to me, and told the story of her own broken engagement. But she said about the refund, they couldn't do it. There was a contract in place. They were only entitled to get 10% back. And so this woman had two options: to forfeit the rest of the deposit or to go ahead with the banquet anyway. And it seemed crazy, but this woman said that the more she thought about it, she thought, stuff it, I'm going to go ahead with this banquet. The more she liked the idea of just having this party, not a wedding banquet of course, but just a big blowout. Because of her history, 10 years before, she had been living in a homeless shelter. She'd gotten back on her feet, found a job, been able to set aside some money, and now that she had the wild notion of using her savings to treat down-and-out people of Boston to a night on the town. And Yancey goes on to say that, so it was that in June 1990, the Hyatt Hotel in downtown Boston hosted a party such as it had never seen before. The hostess sent invitations to rescue missions and homeless shelters, and on a warm summer night that year, people who were used to peeling off half-gnawed pizza off cardboard dined instead on chicken cordon bleu, and Hyatt waiters in tuxedos served hors d'oeuvres to senior citizens who were propped up by crutches and walkers. Vagrants and addicts took one night off from the hard life of the streets outside and instead sipped champagne, ate chocolate wedding cake and danced until all hours of the night. It's that sort of party that Jesus says Don't invite the high and mighty. Don't invite those who can repay you. Love is its own virtue, its own reward. And that humility as virtue is what we take for granted today in our society. But it wasn't taken for granted back then. It was revolutionary. It was so radical in Jesus' time when he told these stories. And so that's why we need to read these stories through that lens and see how radical they really are. See how radical Jesus really was. And how he just completely upended the social order of the day. Because it was about love and about humility being a good thing and lowering yourself for others. As we go into communion, we'll talk about that, about Jesus giving himself on a Roman cross of all things for others, for us. Amen.